Hey guys, Peter Franson here from christiangeekcentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions. I thought I would take a little bit of time and walk you through the comics I've been trying out from the first year of DC Comics' New 52 initiative, which started back in 2011 and was a soft reboot of the DC Universe. Since recently subscribing to the DC Universe Infinite app, I've really appreciated the chance to go back and give this era of comics another try. This was the time during which I dropped comics entirely as far as regular weekly collecting, after having been a regular weekly collector for close to a decade or more, maybe. And so now, since for basically $8 a month, I can read and risk as many comics as I want, I decided to go back and give this era another try, see if DC could get me back into reading their comics regularly. And so I have decided to approach this by reading them in order of publication. So instead of following one book and going like, let's read this whole story arc of this one book, I am using dc.fandom.com to follow along with the publishing history month to month, and as if I was kind of a time traveler with unlimited resources, going back to a comic book store in October of 2011 or September of 2011 and just buying all the comics that I'm interested in, all for that one entry price of $8, and just reading month by month with the publishing schedule and seeing what I stick with and what I don't. And so I have now made it through the first year of the New 52 initiative and thought I would kind of report on my reactions to some of these series. Now, there were, about 52 plus books released as part of this initiative every month, and so I'm not following near all of them, and I'm not even going to talk about the ones that I maybe tried for a few issues at the beginning and then dropped off. I'm going to focus on the comics that I am still reading as of the 1 year in to this initiative, or that I have just recently decided to drop. First comic I'll mention is All-Star Western, which is one that I just recently decided to let go of, and this follows the adventures of Jonah Hex and DC's other Old West characters. This is kind of the book that is used to introduce you to the different characters from DC history that have lived during the Old West, and so it's very appropriately called All-Star Western, but mostly focuses on Jonah Hex, although it does almost always, I think, have a supplementary shorter story at the end of each issue that introduces you to some other character from the Old West, and they usually find their way into the story at some point, the main story that focuses on Hex. I loved the art style of this, the mood of it, and I have really come to enjoy the genre of Western in the last 5 to 10 years. And so just exploring this side of the DC Universe was kind of neat. It also has some light ties to what was going on in the Batman books, because this book takes place in Gotham during the Old West. And so some of the things that were going on with the the Court of Owls in the Scott Snyder Batman story, we were seeing threads of that here, which was kind of interesting to tie those things together. Ultimately, I let it go because although aesthetically I liked a number of things about it, I guess I just wanted, by 12 issues in, to understand more of Jonah Hex, who he is, why he is the way that he is. I really like character-driven stuff, and he's a fully formed character, I think, in the way that he's portrayed. I get the sense that there's a lot going on to him, but they're not revealing, they're not sharing his past in the way that I want. So it feels like the writers know who he is, and so I appreciate that. It's character focused in that way, but I want to kind of be let in on his past and understand better what drives him myself, and we just didn't seem to be getting there 12 issues in, and so I let this one go. But it's one that I'll probably keep an eye on covers for and see if there's maybe a story arc that starts up that will catch my interest. Another book that I just very recently let go of was Animal Man, and this one has just been praised critically and understandably, in my opinion. It really is kind of like a horror book in the context of a superhero universe. They redefine where Animal Man's powers come from, make them much more supernatural in their origin, and he, it turns out, is some kind of avatar of the Red, which is the underlying force that is at the heart of like living or life forms that have blood. And so we've got the red, the green, and the rot. The green is like plant life and the underlying entity or force or whatever that's giving substance and life to all things that are in plant. So likewise, the red focuses on animal life, and then the rot is their common enemy. That is the governing power behind death and decay. And so Animal Man, Swamp Thing, these books are kind of like connected. We discover over time that they're dealing with the same enemy, which is the rot. And it's really, really cool. In many ways, it is totally my cup of tea, especially Animal Man, because the rot, when it uses decaying bodies or dead bodies to do its evil deeds, there's lots of body horror, and it's very much clearly inspired by John Carpenter's The Thing, where you've got flesh monsters and gore monsters and all kinds of crazy stuff going on. I think, well, and another major thing that I really enjoyed about this book in the first year was the focus on Animal Man's family. The character Animal Man, the concept of Animal Man, I always thought was a little bit silly. And I love it when writers find ways, like Jeff Johns in particular, but this isn't written by Jeff Johns, it's written by Jeff Lemire, it looks like is the name. When writers can take characters that are thought of as silly and take you into their lives, their motives, and maybe even do something with their power set or their status quo and change it up a bit so that they become cool and interesting. And that certainly was the case, I think, in Animal Man. And like I said, going into his family, he's a family man. He has two kids that are like elementary and junior high, maybe aged, and a wife that he loves. It's a committed marriage. It's not in crisis. And so kind of like the recent Superman and Lois series, it's taking us into the struggles of kind of like a working man. I think that a lot of people can relate to, except he happens to be a superhero, and he's got all these problems that have an effect on his family and stuff. And so I really appreciate a lot of what they're doing. I think at some point I was just like, it's a little bit one note in terms of what they're doing. We're still going up against the rot. It still has the same tone, the gore monsters and stuff like that. It's still kind of that same enemy that we're fighting. And it's not that I want them to change things up, because I love that stuff. But I think I was like, I think I'm going to set this down for now. But I know that I don't know, but I'm pretty confident I'll get an itch for this kind of book again. And at that point, I'll go back and just read it in bursts instead of following along in the publishing schedule like I have been. Animal Man, I think, is a book that I'm not done with, but I will read to an arc at a time going forward. Speaking of Jeff Johns, Aquaman is a book that I also, let's see, did I decide to let go of that one or not? Let me look at my pull list here. Is it still, it is, looks like it's, oh yeah, no, okay, it's still on my pull list, but hanging on maybe by a thread. I really love Jeff Johns' writing in almost any situation, and I love the character that he brings to Aquaman and how he makes him sympathetic and plays into the stereotypical views and thoughts that people have about Aquaman in this series. Also, his love interest, Mera, I don't think they're married at this point, I could be wrong, but she's a major supporting character and is super awesome, as seen in the Justice League Snyder Cut. Her power set, being able to control water, is really cool, and she's just a very strong, commanding character and presence in the stories. What I have problems with is the others. There's a team that Aquaman evidently was a part of. They show that in flashbacks throughout this first year. And this is kind of a Justice League tied together by artifacts from the past of Atlantis or something. I can't really remember. I really don't find it interesting. All these characters, I believe, were created specifically fresh for this story arc, and I'm just not interested in them. I don't want an Aquaman book that's kind of a team book. And it's not exactly that. It certainly focuses by far mostly on Aquaman and secondarily on Mera, but there's still a lot of time given to his past history with the others and explaining who they are and showing flashbacks of their missions and stuff. And I'm like, no, I just want you to zero in on Aquaman and show me even more and more why he is an interesting character, what makes him tick. They did get into some of that. There's some dark parts of Aquaman's past, some choices that he made that he's having to live with that would not be seen by many others as heroic, and just like this, problems that specifically with his main arch nemesis Black Manta. And so I like what they're doing there a lot, but I feel like the waters are muddied, or too much time is given. I don't know what expression I'm looking for, to the others, and so it's hard for me to really be excited about reading this book every time it's time to come around to it. But once I'm in it, then it's kind of like in my experience going to church on Sundays. I tend to be a social hermit, and so my preference is always going to be, well, let's just stay home. Let's stay home. I don't say that every week, but if my son gets sick, I'm like, I'll stay home with him. You guys go to church, and so I'm never excited about the idea of going to church. Once I'm there, I think to myself, man, why do I ever in my mind have those feelings of resistance about coming? Because this is just something that I need and want, and so in a weird way, Aquaman is a similar experience. Batgirl, on the other hand, I think is a book that I always look forward to. She's recovered. Well, we don't get into in the first year how she recovered or how long it took or whatever, her recovery from being paralyzed. That is still a part of her character's history, but she's now back in action as Batgirl. And what's great about this book is that although she is extremely capable, we are taken by Gail Simone, the writer, into her mind constantly, and we see how insecure she feels and how she's constantly pushing past her own insecurity, where when you have a character like Kyle Rayner back in the day, who they just played up his insecurity, I felt like, but I didn't feel like he was heroic necessarily for pushing past it. They just leaned mostly on his insecurity. Batgirl feels heroic to me because of how she is constantly overcoming her own insecurity and pushing forward in her calling, as it were, despite her insecurity. And there's humor in that too. There's some fish out of water stuff. Despite her being this very established DC character, I constantly feel like I'm reading a fish out of water book because of how over her head she feels in all the situations that she's in. And so it's not even the stories themselves or the villains necessarily that she's up against, although there is at least one very compelling villain early on that she's up against that I think is called the Mirror or something like that, and he's got really an interesting backstory. Gail Simone writes just wonderful villains, wonderfully motivated villains and disturbed villains, and so that has certainly continued here. But it's really not the stories, it's Barbara Gordon and what Gail Simone reveals and takes us into inside of her mind that keeps me into this book and will probably keep me with it at least as long as she had been writing it. That brings us now to Batman, as written by Scott Snyder. This is the famous Court of Owls storyline, which this is the first time I had read it. Before getting DC Universe Infinite, I got the trade paperback for the first volume of this story. So I'd already read the first, 5, 6 issues, but I reread them as part of this whole process and still found them enjoyable the second time through. And then the second half of the story was all fresh and new to me. And I really enjoyed it, despite I think it maybe being overblown and overhyped and praised by people over the years. I still really enjoyed it, and I'm glad that I read it. Here we have Bruce discovering that there is this Illuminati-type organization that is under the surface, deep under the surface of Gotham and its history that he did not know about. Batman has been a character who has made himself, his legend, synonymous with Gotham, calling Gotham my city, and we are one, and that kind of stuff. There's lots of that kind of talk in Batman books, but he's having to face the reality that there's an entire side of Gotham that he does not know. And so I like that kind of status quo change, that maybe sense of added humility that Batman is forced to face regarding his connection to Gotham City. And this is an enemy that really does take him to his limits in several respects, both physically and mentally and personally. There's some ways that it touches on his own personal life that I won't get into, but yeah, I really enjoyed this story. I hope that Scott Snyder can keep it up. It looks like he gets into Death of the Family, which is another pretty striking story. I don't know that it's as celebrated as The Court of Owls, but I'm looking forward to getting into it and seeing if Scott Snyder can kind of keep the quality up as far as the kinds of things that interest me. Batman and Robin is a book that I really did not think I was going to like. But as I mentioned on the Christian Geek Central podcast a number of weeks ago, when I kind of started this whole process, I'm in a different place now than I was in 2011 when this came out. I was pretty new to being a dad at that point. I think I maybe had a newborn. I think Asher. No. I guess no. My youngest had just been born. So I had boys, but they were very young, younger than Damian Wayne is supposed to be in this story. And Damian Wayne is a very divisive character. A lot of people like him. A lot of people dislike him because he's a snot. And I won't get into his whole backstory apart from saying that he is Bruce Wayne's actual son, but was raised by the League of Assassins until reaching about 10 years old, at which point his mom dropped him off with Bruce and said, the Assassins are trying to kill him now. He's only going to be safe with you. And so Bruce, just out of obligation to keep him alive, keeps him with him and realizes at some point that he is going to be less trouble and do less harm if he is with him. Kind of almost like keep your friends close and your enemies closer. And so he allows Damian to be Robin, in part, I think, so that Bruce can really be hands-on in training and influencing him and hopefully shaping him into less of an assassin type and more of like the kind of boy that he would like him to be. And I really disliked Damian and still don't like the way he was introduced by Grant Morrison. That story was very weird and didn't make any sense to me. But as I saw him being introduced here, I began to relate to not Damian and really liking Damian, but relating to Bruce more as a dad and just, that Damian is a snot. But if you're a father, your kids at one time or another have modes where they are snots. We would not say that any of our kids are, oh my gosh, my kid is as bad as Damian, or he's like Damian all the time. No, Damian is pretty much all the time representing, I think, a mode that every kid can be in, which is the mode of being a snot and being maybe destructive or hard to manage as a parent or impossible to manage as a parent, And so I find in these stories things going on between Bruce and Damian that I can relate to as part of the parent experience. And because of that, I think I found some of their connections and moments very moving, actually. However, I can't say that I'm necessarily going to stick with this because it's not always focusing on that. And the stories themselves I find fairly forgettable, except for the ways that they provide opportunities for the father-son dynamic to really emerge in a moving and powerful way. And so as long as they lean into that, it's going to keep my interest. But when they don't, I think that's when I'm going to struggle. Now, I'm guessing with a storyline coming up like the Death in the Family, that I will see them leaning into that in ways that will be satisfying, but only time will tell. Deathstroke is a book that I just gave up on recently. I liked a lot of what was going on in the first year. I don't mind reading about anti-heroes as long as they're interesting, and he was interesting for a good chunk of that. And they introduced in the third issue a villain named Legacy, which I won't spoil. It has a very cool concept, and I do think that Deathstroke is worth reading until that story arc ends, which is all written by Kyle Higgins. So up through issue 8, I really liked what I was reading, but then a new creative team took over in issue 9, And well, let me just talk briefly about Legacy and what I liked about it. It's very much connected to Deathstroke's personal life and to his family history. And the concept of the villain Legacy is also cool. I won't get into, yeah, I don't want to spoil it. But so I think that because of those things, and because Deathstroke is very intelligent. He's kind of like a villain version of Batman in a lot of ways. He has a very tactical mind, and he's physically very capable, but for the most part is still a normal human being. Yes, he has accelerated healing. He's kind of like Captain America levels. You know, he's not like superhuman strength, but neither is he completely a normal human being. He's got kind of Captain America stuff going on. But anyway, still kind of street level villain, but capable of being smart enough to take on the most powerful metahumans in the DC universe if he preps. So he's that kind of character, really, really cool in that regard. And as I said, the stakes get very personal, and I really liked this Kyle Higgins run. After that, starting with issue 9, we get a new creative team, and then we get Lobo introduced to the story, and I almost immediately lost interest, just because I really don't like Lobo as a character. I didn't like the change in the art, and so yeah, I think maybe I will come back to it at some point. Maybe I'll try it. It looks like another creative team does take over with issue 13, so maybe I'll jump back into this. But yeah, we'll see. It's not the original Kyle Higgins creative team, so I don't know. We'll see, but for now I've dropped it. Demon Knights is another one that I have enjoyed quite a bit, but at the same time can imagine that I might drop in the not too distant future. We'll see. It is, like All-Star Western, a genre book that's scratching a particular itch for me, and that's the itch of fantasy. It takes place in the medieval era of the DC universe, and it's specifically a medieval era that's like filled with fantasy, to the point where it's like, at a glance you could say, is this supposed to be Earth, or is just some total fantasy world? Well, it is supposed to be Earth, but there are dragons and monsters and magic and sorcerers and all kinds of stuff going on, but still as part of the DC universe timeline, and I think that's the big appeal for me. I do like fantasy stories, and I like a lot of what's going on in these books, and there is a decent amount of character that's focused on, particularly when it comes to Madame Xanadu and her complex relationship with the demon Etrigan and his host, whose name is escaping me at the moment. But yeah, and some of these other characters, like there's an Amazon that's part of this group of quote unquote demon knights. I don't know. The title is a little bit odd. I don't really know why it has. They do kind of reference why it's called that and why this group is referred to as the Demon Knights, but it's very fleeting. It's in one issue. I almost want to call them, Fantasy League of America or something like that. It's just kind of a who's who of fantasy DC characters, and also some new ones as well. As I was about to say, there's an Amazon that kind of is a stand-in for Wonder Woman. She certainly is from Themyscira and is kind of a connection point to that part of the DC universe. And there's a few other things like that. Madame Xanadu also is existing in the modern era. She's an immortal character, and so you can see her in the modern age in Justice League Dark, but then there's also this whole story that involves her going on in Demon Knights. And so, but much like All-Star Western, and then as I mentioned more specifically with Animal Man, yes, it's scratching an itch, but after 12 issues, I'm like, I think I want it to get a little more personal, or there's something I want to connect to the characters a little bit more. That the fantasy thing is not by itself enough to propel me through the rest of this book. So this may be another one that I'm not done with, but I read an arc at a time going forward. Detective Comics is a book that I definitely wanted to like. It starts in such a promising way, in a way I won't spoil, but that has a major status quo change for the Joker at the very end of the first issue. And I was waiting for that to kind of pay off in the issues that followed, and it really doesn't. It's very briefly and rarely referred to, and the rest is just kind of the ongoing adventures of Batman, and there's just stuff going on that I don't care about in this book. I felt like there was a promise being made at the end of that first issue that was just has not been paid off. Now I think it is going to start paying off when we get to the death of the family storyline, which is coming up, and we'll cross over into Batman Detective Comics. I'm talking about this as though it's going to happen, and again, these are all books that were published in 2011, 2012, stuff like that. But in the mode that I'm in, there's kind of a part of my future. So I mean, maybe what I'll do actually is I will come back to this series as a part of Death of the Family, probably to follow the storyline that they're going to, I would guess, tell, crossing over from through all the Batman books. And so maybe I'll use that as kind of a test bed to kind of see, okay, what do I think of the current creative team's writing style, as I'm trying this out, and which is, I'm sure, what DC wants you to do when they have crossover events like that. But the ongoing status quo of the book itself has just not been interesting to me. Another one that I really wanted to give a second chance to is Earth 2. This is basically a redesign of the classic Justice Society and their origins and the world they come from. No longer are they aged World War II based characters. Now they are on a parallel Earth. They are all young and new to their powers, new as heroes. They're in a world that just lost Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman, and so these are kind of like the heroes that are taking their place. And I vaguely remember there being controversy around like the demographic box checking going on with Alan Scott, choosing to make him a homosexual character. And I don't remember if that at the time was a role in kind of turning me off. I don't think it was, apart from the fact that it's like I just glaringly saw demographic box checking and didn't see enough investment in characters in the way that I wanted. But this time through, I read at least one issue more than I did the last time when I really gave this book a try back in 2012. And I just didn't care. I think part on a meta level, because I knew that eventually we are going to get a return of the Justice Society, as just happened like a year or so ago. And so I'm just thinking to myself, these guys, they're going to get wiped anyway. How much future do they really have? Now, they have a considerable amount of future, because even after this series ends, which it ends after, let's see here, I don't know, 32 some issues, so that's a respectable run. But then the title just gets rebranded as like the Earth 2 Final Days or whatever. I don't know. It's retitled, and then that story goes for another like 30 some issues. And so it has a decent lifespan if you want to dig into this alternate version of the Justice Society characters. But for me, I love the JSA so much that seeing them vanish and seeing these other versions of them that I don't think are more interesting conceptually. In fact, I think they're less interesting for the fact that they are fresh new heroes. I love the fact that the original Justice Society were veterans and mentors to other heroes in the DC universe. It was just such a unique treasure in comic books to have this whole team of like heroes that, at least biologically, because their aging has been slowed down to some degree, by various causes, they are, maybe in their 50s, 60s, something like that. That's just so cool to see that. And I don't think that was happening in Marvel or any other comics line. It was like this thing that DC was doing that had these legacy characters that they were hanging on to and allowing to be these older mentors. And to get rid of that very unique aspect of who they are and what they represent in the DC universe just seemed, so I just don't care about these alternate, ultimately Elseworld kind of feeling versions of the Justice Society. So, I only stuck with it for about 4 issues, and then I was done. Green Lantern, written by Jeff Johns. This is one of the few books that got almost no sense of reboot, and that's probably because Jeff Johns was the one writing it, and by this time in DC publishing, he had just really established some weight for himself, I think, behind the scenes. And so, if there was going to be a book that wasn't monkeyed with, it was probably going to be Jeff Johns. And it had, just been rebooted in a sense with Rebirth not long before the New 52 initiative. And so, I can see them not wanting to kind of start from scratch again, as it were. What we have here is Sinestro has been reinstated as a Green Lantern, shockingly, and that is eventually explained as to how that's justifiable. And and Hal Jordan finds himself being swept along with Sinestro and kind of subject to him again. For those who don't know, Sinestro was the Green Lantern that initially trained Hal Jordan before Sinestro famously went bad and turned against the Corps and became a traitor. And so there's a little bit of a repeat here, a little echo of the early days of Hal Jordan, but I think that's only going to be appreciated by fans who are aware of that. This is not particularly a good jumping on point for Green Lantern, but it is that dynamic between Sinestro and Hal that largely keeps me interested in this book, in addition to just the general writing style of John's, which I do enjoy, and it's a very character-focused writing style that's constantly putting characters in situations or with other characters that allow those personality traits to naturally emerge as a result of the situations that they're in and the characters they're interacting with. And so I like that kind of character-focused type of writing that Johns does. And we also get a little bit more exploration, well, significant further exploration of the Indigo Tribe, which is one of the many color lantern corps that were introduced a few years prior to this. You got red lanterns and, of course, green lanterns and yellow lanterns and orange lanterns and, indigo colored lanterns and black lanterns. Eventually there was a story involving Black Hand, and he comes back into this first year of storytelling as well. And I liked Blackest Night, and so I'm interested in Black Hand. And so, this is not like what I would call the peak of what I enjoyed in Jeff Johns' writing of Green Lantern, but it's still writing that I really enjoy about characters and a set of lore in the Green Lantern mythos that I really enjoy and care about. And so I've been enjoying it, and I definitely plan to stick with it. Still enjoyable, but to a lesser degree for me, has been Green Lantern Corps, which likewise I've enjoyed because of its character focus, namely the focus on Guy Gardner and John Stewart. They are kind of like the two characters that really are the familiar faces and the main focus in this book, and so we get to know not necessarily their backstories. I think we're going to get into Guy Gardner's origin is going to be retold pretty soon here. I'm about to read number 0, and I think that's going to retrace Guy Gardner's origin. But it's not so much that it reintroduces their origins, but it reintroduces them as characters and kind of like the kinds of things that drive them. John Stewart is forced to make a very difficult decision that was a neat character moment, and then we experience the fallout of that decision after the fact. We see aspects of Guy Gardner that I really appreciate, including, not only his pre-existing tendency to kind of rebel against authority and to just kind of like say whatever's on his mind without worrying about the consequences. That's all still there, and I appreciate that. But he also has a great loyalty to John Stewart, which I wouldn't have expected. I mean, Guy has had a rocky history with other Green Lanterns, particularly other Earth Green Lanterns, and so it was neat to kind of see his loyalty to John play out in this story. What has been kind of interesting for me to adjust to and figure out how I feel about is the art style, and namely how crowded a lot of the pages are. It's almost a George Perez type of crowding where it's like, let's see how many characters we can fit into a single panel. And I think part of that is because it is the Green Lantern Corps, and they want to constantly give us this sense of there's a ton of Green Lanterns here, and there are situations in these stories that require tons of Green Lanterns to respond to. And so it is neat in one sense to see all these lanterns on screen, as it were, at the same time, with all kinds of ring constructs going on. It's very busy in terms of what's happening in many of these panels. But sometimes I feel like, I'm kind of getting numb to this after a while, and so I almost wish that those shots where we have tons of stuff going on all at once would be used a little more sparingly, and we would drill in or focus in more on the facial expressions maybe, or some of the visual nuance of storytelling that has to do with Guy Gardner and John Stewart. But anyway, on the whole, I enjoy what they're doing. I enjoy some of the status quo shifts that they're bringing about in both characters and in the Green Lantern Corps itself. And so, coming up, I've just started into the Third Army story, which I remember by the end of that, I believe that's Jeff Johns' last story. By the end of that, I was like, yeah, okay, I think Jeff Johns jumped the shark at some point. So I'm anticipating not being super into the story that is just starting now as of issue like 12 or 13. But this is another book that I think I'm going to definitely be sticking with for the foreseeable future, at least. A Green Lantern book I'm not sticking with, however, is Green Lantern New Guardians. It's an interesting kind of concept going on where mysteriously these various rings from one ring from each of the different colored cores is coming to Kyle and presenting themselves to Kyle and selecting him to be a part of that corps. And so he's kind of a member of all of these Lantern Corps at once, and then as the story progresses, he's really trying to figure out what this mystery is all about, and is bringing a representative of each of the corps together to help him solve this mystery. And so I think the thing that is potentially interesting about this story is seeing these different representatives of these different corps have to work together. You know, we've got the Star Sapphire that's from a corps that's all about love and the passionate love. We've got Arkillo, who is from the Sinestro Corps, which is all about fear and producing fear. And we've got the Rage Lantern, and we've got the Compassion Lantern, and all these kinds of personalities that are kind of having to work together. And you would think, based on what I said about the last couple of books, that would be of real interest to me, but it's only, I mean, these characters themselves are not super established, like the Rage Lantern and the little Orange Lantern construct and the Blue Lantern and stuff. They're just not as established as Sinestro and Hal and Guy and John, and so to see them rubbing elbows with each other and kind of butting heads now and then is not as much of an interesting novelty, because I don't have an appreciation for their backstories and their history, because they just don't have as much backstory and history as these other characters. And so that as a novelty is not really helping me through this book. And Kyle himself, unfortunately, I don't find to be very interesting at this point. The big thing that Kyle is known for is being the sole Green Lantern in comics for a while, and having to figure out how to be a Green Lantern with no training, and being someone who, at the time, before they retconned it more with the New 52, at the time was chosen randomly. And so there's lots of stuff about his insecurity that he's working through. But over the course of that run, before the Corps was brought back, Kyle became more and more confident, and eventually by the end of that kind of came into his own as a Green Lantern. And the problem with him since then is there's not a strong sense of his personality that I get apart from that insecurity that he was so known for. And so I just don't find him, where he's at now, to be a character that's very interesting. They haven't established other character traits about Kyle that stand out to me as interesting and particularly relatable. He's, you know, a guy trying to do the right thing, but so are all superheroes at the end of the day, I think. So I just haven't felt enough to keep me going with this one. But I think it's a book that I will check in with, maybe follow some of the crossover issues with the upcoming Rise of the Third Army storyline and Wrath of the First Lantern after that. Oh, that's right, it was Wrath of the First Lantern, not Rise of the Third Army. That was Jeff Johns', I think, last story where I felt like he jumped the shark. So anyway, this book goes on for a while, and so it goes on for 40 issues, and so there are certainly chances that I will have to give it another try, but for now, I am setting it aside. Justice League, written by Jeff Johns, is a book that I am enjoying, but it's not like a stellar experience for me. The main novelty, as I've mentioned with some of these other books that I'm keeping on my list, is seeing the characters rub elbows, butt heads, and react to each other, and collectively figure out how they're going to respond to the situations that they're in. The opening story arc with Darkseid and kind of reestablishing a new origin for the Justice League is cool. I'm a little overly familiar with it, though, so reading it again wasn't very special. And then after that, it's some shorter arcs. We're introducing Shazam as kind of a backup story in each issue, and so it's It's not doing anything right now that's super engaging to me, but I'm sticking with it because, again, the novelty of these characters in the same book reacting to each other and the writing style of Jeff Johns are enough to keep me going for now. I'm a little surprised that I'm sticking with Justice League Dark. I didn't give this book even a single issue back in 2011 when it launched. But I'm seeing why people have enjoyed it, why it's gotten some attention in the animated movie world. We've got, again, this side of the DC universe that is conveniently being explored by bringing some of the most famous magical characters of the DC universe together, I mean many of them anyway, into this book, having them this book is just kind of, in DC's past, a lot of times you'll see different supernatural characters show up in different books, but with some of these books in the New 52, like the All-Star Western book, or here in Justice League Dark, they seem to be trying to collect and leverage all the different properties they have that fit the genre of Old West, or fantasy in the case of Demon Knights, or the supernatural in the case of Justice League Dark. And I like that. I like them collecting the best of those, or what they maybe think is the best, and leveraging them in a book that is all about that sector of the DC universe. And so Justice League Dark, it prominently features some characters that I've never had any interest in before, like John Constantine, Deadman. I still can't get over Deadman's costume. I think he looks a little silly. Zatanna with her backwards talking spells, but it works, and I think it's in part because they acknowledge some of the weirdness of those characters. The fact that Boston Brand is walking around in his trapeze outfit, and they acknowledge Zatanna, some of the weirdness of Zatanna's backwards spells, and they just make it work in a cool way. And I think in part for me, it's because they go so dark with the storytelling. They linked Animal Man, Justice League Dark, and Swamp Thing together as kind of dealing, at least initially, with this same enemy of the Rot. And there's a good amount of crossover with these books as well. And so that helped me kind of maintain an interest in all three of them. Right now, I think the Justice League Dark, of those supernaturally oriented books, is the only one that I'm sticking with. And in part because I've just regained an appreciation for the supernatural side of the DC universe, and Justice League Dark allows me a window to kind of keep tabs on what's going on in the supernatural side of DC continuity. And I also like these characters compared to other characters in other team books. These characters are rougher individuals. John Constantine in particular is really an anti-hero. He is a guy who's really kind of a scummy guy in a lot of respects, but finds himself in these situations where he is, at least as a peripheral goal of his, is serving the good of humanity and being a part of something that is going to save humanity. He's in it for usually for very selfish reasons. And so it's just interesting to see a character like that being used in all these situations to accomplish a lot of good, even though he himself has extremely selfish motives, is manipulating and screwing around with his allies, and really frustrating them at the same time. And so seeing that kind of relationship dynamic between the characters is another aspect of the book that I'm really enjoying, and that is going to keep me with it for at least a little while longer. We'll see. Supergirl just recently gave up on this one. I love how she's a fish out of water and is arriving from her perspective anyway, fresh from Krypton, doesn't speak English, really trying to, figure out how to communicate with people and all the problems that causes. And so I like a number of the situations that she's found herself in because of the premise of her situation. But apart from her dealing with this crisis of I just lost my family, I don't speak the language here, I guess I'm ready for them to move beyond that and take me into who Kara is, apart from this immediate problematic situation that she finds herself in. And 12 issues in, I'm just not getting a sense of, okay, who is she when it's not all hitting the fan in her life? And that's, I guess, what I want more of. And I'm not getting yet, so I am dropping this one, probably for good. I don't know what kind of story would potentially pull me back in. I think I know enough about her status quo that I'll enjoy seeing her tie into Superman books, as she probably will in the future, that I'll read, or other books. And then maybe, I'll check back in on her when there's a cover of Supergirl that indicates a major status quo change or something. Swamp Thing I also recently dropped, in large part because I think I'm a little bit burned out on the Rot as a villain and some of the shared villains that this book has had with Justice League Dark, and then especially Animal Man. And yeah, I think they're kind of hitting some of the same beats again and again that just aren't that interesting to me, but I'm glad that I read as much as I did so I could understand the backstory, at least the rebooted backstory of Swamp Thing, because he is a character that when big stuff is going on in the DC Universe, he is very often part of the story and a significant part of the story as kind of like the avatar of plant life on Earth. So I'm glad that I went on this journey, and I think that the book, in terms of the way it looks, the art, and the way that they lay out panels and stuff, which sounds like a very technical thing, but if you read the book, you'll know what I'm talking about, is very artistic, very interesting. So from a visual standpoint, I think I like this book every time, but the story just isn't quite enough of what I want, or isn't innovating or changing things up enough for me to really want to stick with it, at least for now. But maybe, like Animal Man, it'll be a book that I'll want to come back to an arc at a time. Finally, Teen Titans. Another book that I just recently dropped. I actually, not long before that, dropped Superboy. I stuck with Superboy for a good, 7 or 8 issues, maybe longer than that. And that was enough to kind of get, okay, the rebooted origin of Superboy, okay, check. I know his backstory now. I'm not interested in following him. And same with the Teen Titans. Okay, I know their new status quo. I know their new backstory. I'm just not interested in sticking with them. And a lot of that has to do with I don't care about these characters apart from their history that they shared prior to the New 52. And, these kind of teens on the run, they are effectively, new characters. Bart Allen strikes me as a different character. Wonder Girl, which she doesn't want to be called Wonder Girl. I didn't really know much about her to begin with, and then they've got these 2 new characters. They've got Bunker and Skitter that just don't interest me at all, and they're getting a lot of attention. And I don't know why they have them in here instead of more familiar and established Teen Titans. And this book suffers from the meta knowledge that I have that eventually, we're going to have the Teen Titans that I care about featured in other books, and there'll be some continuity resets that will, make a lot of the focus of what they're doing here kind of irrelevant, and I guess them being still on the run a bit, and after 12 issues, and not kind of like settling into, something's just not working for me about this. I'm just not interested in either the direction or the characters as they're being presented. So I do have a lot of history with the Teen Titans, especially the Jeff Johns run, and look forward to checking them out and keeping an eye on covers that maybe say, hey, new status quo, and then I'll give them another try. But for now, I'm done. So that's all of them for now. In summary, just 8, 10 books that I'm sticking with here. Suicide Squad. Gosh, did I even comment on Suicide Squad when this all started? I can't even remember now. Yeah, somehow I missed commenting on Suicide Squad here, but this is also a book that I'm sticking with. As I mentioned before, I'm fine with following anti-heroes or even villains in their stories as long as they're interesting, and I like the Suicide Squad formula, the Secret Six formula, what is often the case in books that focus on villains, which are usually Suicide Squad. Secret Six was just kind of like Suicide Squad by a different name. But when the writers write these series well, one of the things that they do that I really like is they take these 3rd, 4th, 5th tier villains of the week in some cases, and knowing that they're going to kill them, they will kind of really put effort into making them cool or interesting for the brief time that they're still alive in this book. And sometimes they'll surprise you by saying, no, not only are we revamping and making this villain interesting, we're going to keep them around for a while too, So I just like that kind of reinvigoration of some of these often forgotten characters in the DC universe. And then also, because they're villains, their personalities bump up against each other in even more dramatic ways. There's even more friction than in a book that's about a bunch of heroes. And so, and also the stakes, I don't want to say that the stakes are higher, but I mean, things just get more brutal. Characters are dying, and they're getting jacked up in ways that are not going to happen in other books where, you don't want the characters to die. And so seeing that kind of stuff happen is cool as well. And so, yeah, for now, it's just a different feeling book. It's about villains on black ops missions. So the whole premise itself is just fresh compared to so many other books that are regularly being published. So yeah, and the writing style, the character focus, all of that, it's working for me. So yeah, I'm going to stick with this one for now for sure. Okay, so now to wrap up, the 10 books I'm sticking with for now are Suicide Squad, Justice League Dark, Justice League, Green Lantern Corps, Green Lantern, Demon Knights, Batman, Batgirl, Aquaman, and Batman and Robin. Interesting, I got 3 Bat books in there, and I'm not particularly a Batman fan, but, I just go, as I noticed a number of years ago to be the case, I just go where I like the writing. It's not so much for me about what's traditionally my favorite comic book characters and stuff. Green Lantern is my favorite concept for a superhero, but ultimately I'm sticking with those books because I like the writing that's going on. That's a major component. If I didn't like the writing, then no amount of Green Lanternness would make me stick with it. So yeah, I love that I've narrowed it down to these 10 books that basically I can feel confident that when I sit down and read them, I am going to enjoy them. Now, there may be a couple. We'll see Aquaman, Batman and Robin, possibly Green Lantern. I mean, any one of these, I suppose, in just a couple of issues could go south and be something that I'll not be excited to read and then maybe eventually drop. But right now, I feel like I'm going to have a good experience when I sit down and read any one of these. And so, a nice, relatively speaking, tight list of titles. And maybe I'll report again after I've gotten through another year of the New 52 publishing schedule, and we'll see what I am reading then. Hey guys, thanks for tuning in. We've got a ton going on here at Spirit Blade Productions and Christian Geek Central, including our in-depth Bible study for geeks, movie, game, and other entertainment reviews or commentary, live streams, Christian geek news, original audio dramas, and tons more. And on top of all that, you can become a Spirit Blade insider with an influential voice and get access to exclusive content and rewards. It's your involvement as a patron that will keep all of this going and growing. So I want to thank you for your consideration in that. For more information, please check out our Patreon page through the link below at patreon.com/spiritbladeproductions. Thanks for listening.